Hello and welcome to This Is. Nintendo have created many consoles over the years, so today Matt and I are going to create the ultimate tier list of which Nintendo console is truly the greatest. Can I just say Virtual Boy and we're done with the video, or is that not okay?
Virtual Boy was horrible.
The Virtual Boy was ahead of its time though, literally 20 years ahead of its time. So it had the advantage of giving you a real sort of 3D effect. It looked cool. Okay, who am I kidding? Yeah, Virtual Boy sucked. I think just for the novelty, I would give it D.
I'll concede to D.
Okay, excellent. So we're driving that to D.
I want it noted though that you are significantly more lenient than I am.
Very true, very true. Would you like to pick the next console, my friend?
Let's talk about the Wii U.
The Wii U? Wow, we're just going from strength to strength here.
I think we can all agree that the Wii was amazing. The Wii U followed up with zero of that momentum.
Whoa, whoa. I'm gonna cut you off right there. So the Wii U, in a lot of ways, was a prototype for the Switch we have today. It had the controller, which obviously had the tablet function. You could play without even the console connected to a TV if you wanted to. And there were a ton of great games on the Wii U, right? The problem is that all of those games, with literally almost any exceptions, have been moved over to the Switch, which means that there's not a lot of reason to actually play the Wii U.
The tablet was legitimately cool when it came out, but you could only have the one tablet. It would have been so much cooler to have that be an option to have like multiplayer. I can literally think of only one, maybe two uses for the Wii U tablet that were legitimately, like actually groundbreaking.
It was almost like the DS problem, right? Of so many games on the DS didn't really do anything with the second screen, right? Like it was a cool idea and some games were able to take advantage of it. But with the Wii U, it was very much this will be cool, but it never found its killer app.
F tier.
F tier, thumbs down. Let's go with the original Game Boy. This is a device that has a very fond place in my heart, but we have to consider that the original Game Boy was way behind pretty much all of its competitors in a lot of key areas.
But wait, hold on. Was it behind? Because it came out before any other competitor.
Within a year or two, okay, fair.
Yeah, the Game Gear came out after the original Game Boy. So it's hard to say that they're behind. It was a very, 80s, 90s strategy for Nintendo of if it's not broke, don't fix it. Problem is they did wait a little too long to fix it.
That's the thing. So with all of these tiers, we're considering the console as a whole, right? So the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Light, it's all lumped into one tier. And the thing is, the Game Boy Color, I do believe, was a sequel, but even it was a fairly minor sequel, and it took almost 10 years to come out.
Nostalgia is definitely playing a factor in here, so I'm biased on this one. But this is S tier to me, no brainer. I still have my original Game Boy from 1998.
The only thing I would say against it being S tier is that if you go to try to play an original Game Boy today, that green screen is rough. There's no backlighting, and even though it had decent battery life, that thing still eats through 4 AA batteries really quickly. I feel like today I would much rather play like a Game Boy Advance like SP or something, which is the only reason why I kind of feel like the original Game Boy may need to be A tier instead of S tier.
We wouldn't have the Game Boy Advance if the Game Boy, the Game Boy walked so the SP could run.
All right, I can't argue with that. Next up, let's take a little bit of a trip into weird land with the Nintendo 64. I don't know where to start with the 64, right? So the 64 had some major issues right out of the gate, right? It was the only console that didn't really, in this generation, move over to a CD or an optical disc, which I think hurt it in some ways. It really meant that the games had to be much smaller. The Nintendo 64 also had a huge advantage of being incredibly powerful. It was significantly ahead of rivals like the Saturn and especially the PlayStation. And on top of that, it had some of the most revolutionary games. I mean, look, how do you try to tell me that Mario 64 is not one of the most important games of all time?
I'm personally not a huge Mario fan, but I agree with you that, it's a super important game. My big issue with the N64 was that there was no built-in memory with it. You can argue that, okay, well, neither did the PlayStation, neither did the Saturn, but that was supposed to be the trade-off you get from going to the optical drive versus the cartridge. The cartridge was supposed to have onboard memory. I didn't have a memory card for the N64. So I just kept replaying games from the beginning every time.
I thought most games actually saved on the cartridge though.
So I remember I had Quest 64, which was like a knockoff between Final Fantasy and Zelda. So it was like kind of somewhere in between the two of them. That one did not save to the cartridge. N64 instilled some really bad habits in me. And it's not very green, so I'm going to give it a B.
You know what? I will 100% agree. I think N64 definitely deserves B tier on this one.
Let's talk about the NES.
Ooh, okay.
The NES was an absolute masterpiece when it came out. They did so many things right with this console because at the time, no one in America cared about video games. In fact, video games were a dirty word in America. Video games were considered toys. There was a whole crash in the 80s of like Mattel stuff, and no one wanted to have any of these. So they rebranded that as the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and then made it look like a VCR. So that way people in America who are too stupid to realize it's a video game would buy that, and it totally worked.
Well, and that's why it's called the Nintendo Entertainment System, because it came with Rob the Robot initially, right? Like it was meant more as a toy, and the video game was just a way to interact with the robot to sort of sneak into the big toy stores of the world. Look, there's a lot we can say about NES. This one's the most straightforward on the list. This is S tier, no question to me. All right, let's get into a little bit of a newer console, the Nintendo Switch. Now this one's a little bit harder to judge because obviously with all of these other consoles, they've all sort of had their run. It's really clear to see their impact. The Switch has only been out for 2 or 3 years now at this point. But I think it's really clear to say that after coming from the Wii U, the Switch was a huge turning point for Nintendo. And especially with games like Animal Crossing now, Switches years later after they first come out have been completely sold out for months, right? I think that the Switch is probably one of the most important Nintendo consoles that have ever been designed.
I 100% agree with you, but at the same time, I have been severely underwhelmed with the Switch. So I paid like $450 for mine. In the first week, I bought it from some eBay scalper. I was so excited to have this. The games that come out for it are either kind of mediocre to me. I mean, Breath of the Wild is great, but that's a Wii U port. But again, like I said, I'm not a huge Mario fan. So like there was this promise of having more third-party titles coming to it, which there have been. There's been a lot of ports of great games to the Switch, but then so many of those games run terribly on the Switch.
I will say though, on the flip side of that argument, the Switch has seen more third-party support from games that you would traditionally find on PlayStation or Xbox. And there's a lot of games on the Switch that are not only, of course, running on the original sort of TV mode where you can compare it and like, oh, it's maybe not quite as good as an Xbox or PS4. But when you look at it in the handheld mode, it's a legitimately really impressive experience.
I've never expecting them to look as good as Xbox or PlayStation. You look at Pokemon Sword and Shield. Again, this was like the promise of the Switch was to get the Pokemon game that we always dreamed of with more power and whatnot. And then like just none of it's been delivered. I'm somewhere in between A and B. I do agree. The console itself is amazing. It's the rest. It's like the ecosystem around the console that I'm like, I don't know.
I'm a firm A on this one. I feel like there's no way to discount the huge impact that the Switch has had. Also, you have to consider the Switch has pretty much absorbed both the handheld and the mainline consoles, right? Like Nintendo doesn't make DSs or 3DSs or Wiis or anything like that anymore. The Switch is everything. To me, firm A tier.
I mean, I'll give you the A tier. I wish that it was S tier.
Next up, let's talk about the Game Boy Color. Now this definitely has a lot of nostalgia attached. This was my very first Game Boy. I grew up playing that Game Boy Color, like Pokemon in the backseat of the car. But the problem with the Game Boy Color is that it's almost not even a full generation upgrade, right? So it technically was about twice as powerful as the original Game Boy, but it came 10 years later. It did introduce color, but the thing is most Game Boy Color games would still run on the Game Boy, right? There were very few games that were exclusive to the Game Boy Color. I feel like Game Boy Color is a C tier. It was a upgrade, but it wasn't a huge upgrade, and it really didn't move the needle very far considering that it was full 10 years later from the original Game Boy, or 9 years later.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on that one.
C tier. Okay, your turn next, my friend.
Let's do the Game Boy Advance. You could make the same argument for the Game Boy Advance. Like the games were better, but same thing. Like it wasn't a huge jump from the color, and the original Game Boy Advance still didn't have the backlit. I mean, I don't know if people today understand the struggles of trying to play one of these Game Boys in the back of the car at night. You turn on the light in the back seat and your dad's like, "No, turn it off, I can't see." So you're trying to play these games using the street lamps as you're driving by. You could make the argument for the original Game Boy Advance. That's not a huge jump, but if we're comparing the Game Boy Advance and we're including like the Game Boy Micro or the Game Boy SP, then I think it's a major jump.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things to talk about with the Game Boy Advance. First of all, this was a legitimate upgrade in performance, right? So most people consider the Game Boy to be almost like a portable SNES, and I don't think that's wildly off, right? So the Game Boy Advance had a wider screen display, it displayed many more colors, it added the shoulder buttons, and honestly, the original Game Boy Advance actually was really nice and comfortable to use. It sort of got rid of the vertical form factor. But when you consider something like the Game Boy Advance SP, that was on a whole other level. You had the backlit screen, you had a rechargeable battery, you had a folding form factor, which honestly, I mean, I would still play the Game Boy Advance SP today. It was great, but it was a very cool experiment. To me, Game Boy Advance is a very firm B tier. I think that it was, personally, although obviously the tier list has to be a little bit more unbiased to this, personally my favorite Game Boy and my favorite handheld console that Nintendo ever made.
So I never had an SP or the Micro. I acknowledge that they were the big upgrades. I'm with you on the B tier on that.
How about the Nintendo Wii? So the Wii is kind of difficult because it still is the best-selling home console that Nintendo has ever put out, right? Sure, the DS and the Game Boy also on the portable side, but the Wii was an absolute phenomenon. I remember years after it came out, people would still be getting in fights over trying to buy a Wii at Christmas time. You had the fact that it had full backwards compatibility, the first time that any Nintendo home console had it. I mean, you even had the Gamecube like memory card ports, you had the actual slots on the top, it would take Gamecube games. And then you also had the fact that it had what I would say a lot of revolutionary features for the time. It had Wi-Fi built in, you had the Wii Remote with all the motion controls. There was a lot going for the Wii.
You know, a couple of my friends and I had actually bought one, not even for the game. We went in on it as a group because it had Wi-Fi and you could put Netflix on it. You know, you had to, when you did Netflix, you had to, this is when you had to actually get a disc from them to install it on, because there's no like app store to download Netflix directly. But having Wi-Fi with Netflix was like a major deal when this came out.
The problem with the Wii though, is that while it had a lot of very cool features, ultimately it was a slightly more powerful GameCube, which meant that while it went in a very different direction, unlike previous consoles, like the GameCube was absolutely up, same with N64, like they were very competitive, but the Wii just simply could not compete remotely with the PS3 and Xbox 360, which meant that the Wii got a lot of terrible games, right? Like sure, there were the first party Nintendo titles, there were some of the fun party games, but beyond that, it was a whole lot of My Little Pony and stuff that really wasn't anywhere near to the same level, which I think really hurts it on this list.
I agree, but I feel like the Wii almost was not marketed for your typical gamer. Like if you look at, it's marketed towards more adults than anything, with like Wii Fit and Wii Sports and whatnot. And then like all the games that you got for it were like the games for like someone's 5-year-old, so they can play mom and dad's Wii. Instead of buying a whole nother console. As
far as I'm concerned, while the Wii has a lot going for it, it also has a lot of negatives. I think it puts it pretty much squarely in the middle of my list. I would give it C tier.
Yeah, I'll accept that.
All right, would you like to pick the next console?
The SNES.
Oh, going for the big guns.
For me, it was hard to imagine a better console when that came out. And obviously, this is before any type of like joysticks where, the thumbsticks were a thing. I thought this was the pinnacle of gaming technology. I love that there was a cartridge adapter to let you play all your Game Boy games on the screen. You had a lot of like TV and movie tie-in games, which were really fun. I remember like Spider-Man, there's a great Power Rangers game, Ninja Turtles. I thought so many good things came to this console, and this is like I think the peak for me gaming wise. To me, this is minimum A tier.
Yeah, I'll go with A tier on this one as well. I think there's no doubt the Super Nintendo was a big step forward from the NES tons of great classics. It was a very solid console, and it ultimately was a major bridge between the NES and then sort of the newer 3D generation getting into the N64. So I would definitely agree that Super Nintendo was A tier. Let's talk the 3DS. The problem with the 3DS is that it launched at $250. It pretty much immediately got a price cut within inside of a year or so. It had a terrible launch lineup. There were very few games that were available for 3DS for quite a while. And the thing is, it was a little bit more powerful, but you look at something like the Vita, it was a massive, massive step forward. The Vita was so much better technically pretty much across the board. Now obviously the 3DS had the great advantage of tons of excellent first-party titles. Then you had the new 2DS XL. It was a major step forward. For me, I think this is pretty firmly in C tier. I think that there's a lot going for the 3DS, but also it was very forgettable. I don't think it really sort of moved the envelope in a way that I think it really could have.
I would actually put it in D tier. I didn't think the 3DS platform found its legs until the 2DS XL. I'm sticking with D tier.
I still feel like that's a little bit harsh, but I will go with you. The 3DS goes in D tier. Next up, let's talk GameCube. This one's kind of hard to place because on one hand, the GameCube personally was one of my favorite consoles. In fact, the GameCube was actually my very first home console from Nintendo. Before that, I had like a PlayStation, but I never had an SNES or an NES. I always played that at like friends' houses. This was the first time that I actually purchased a home console, a home Nintendo console for myself. The GameCube was very well respected as far as performance went. It was really quite powerful, very much better than something like the PS2. It had finally optical discs, although they were small and it was kind of caused some issues. But the GameCube was great, and the GameCube had some excellent games.
I never had a GameCube, and I think I've only played GameCube maybe twice in my whole life.
Well, that was one of the big problems with the GameCube, is that it didn't really sell all that well, and ultimately is one of the reasons why Nintendo decided to go a very different direction with the Wii. But yeah, the GameCube, I think, personally, I like a lot, but ultimately in the confines of this list, I feel like definitely deserves C tier.
I'm gonna agree with you just because I don't have enough experience to argue otherwise.
I will say, I don't think the comments will agree with us. I think the GameCube is widely loved.
Well, so the only people I knew who loved the GameCube were the Smash community.
Yeah, of course. All right, would you like to tee up the last item?
So we have the Nintendo DS.
Did you ever own a Nintendo DS?
I did not.
Whoa, really?
It was a weird time age-wise for me of like, I was in high school, it wasn't, it wasn't cool to be playing Game Boy. So I had a PSP around the same time. So that was what I went with handheld-wise. Now, I fully acknowledge, and I did look at the DS, and I did really want one. And I didn't get one basically because of peer pressure.
It was an interesting hybrid, as so many of these Nintendo consoles were. If you look at something like the PSP, technically far superior. And honestly, I had a PSP and I loved it, right? The PSP was really capable of playing some incredible games, especially given the time frame. But the DS also pushed Nintendo forward in some key areas. While we were talking about the Wii, it's great how it had like Wi-Fi and all these things. The DS had it 2 years beforehand, something like that. And ultimately, the DS, while it was not incredibly powerful, would go on to be one of the most popular consoles of all time, with the DS Lite, with the DSi, with the DSi XL. There were a ton of versions of the DS, and there were some really great games. Of course, there was a lot of shovelware, as with most of these Nintendo consoles, but there are also some absolute killer games with the DS. And for me, this is a really easy B tier. I think the DS was one of the best Nintendo handhelds of all time.
Okay.
And so with that, we have the official Ultimate Nintendo tier list designed by Austin and Matt. Matt, would you like to give any preemptive apologies to the fans who I'm sure are going to be very happy with all of our decisions here?
I'm not gonna preemptively apologize. I'm gonna say we like what we like and you like what you like. Let us know what your rankings are in the comments.